Hello, I'm Adam Levy, and this is Off Limits, Academia's Taboos, a podcast from Nature Careers. In this episode, alcohol. Alcohol and academia have a complex relationship. On the one hand, in many countries and contexts, consuming alcohol is incredibly normalized. In fact, as we heard in last week's episode, people who don't drink for religious reasons can struggle to find social spaces in academia that don't centre around drinking. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that many academics can struggle with alcohol dependency. But while alcohol consumption may be the norm, coming to terms with and openly discussing harmful relationships with the substance remain incredibly taboo. And today we'll meet with two academics who've not only struggled with alcohol, but also with sharing this struggle with others. But both have found ways to transform both their lives and their work to reflect their recoveries. The first is Wendy Dossett. Wendy's a Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at the University of Chester in the UK. Over her career, she's investigated a number of questions related to faith.
In the last decade or so of my career, I turned my religious studies methodologies onto the phenomenon of recovery from addiction.
This is a topic close to Wendy's heart, and so we spoke about her journey with alcohol. Before we start that conversation, please note that this interview does contain reference to sexual violence.
I am a person in long-term recovery. I've been in recovery for 20 years now, so I'm very lucky. But looking back on my student days and my early career, alcohol was a terrible problem for me. Much like lots of people who suffer with substance issues, I had low self-esteem. I felt different from my peers. I felt that I didn't fit in. And substance use enabled me to function for many years. It felt like it was giving me confidence. It felt like it was enabling me to fit in. I experienced sexual abuse at the age of 21, and I reacted to that experience by drinking more, and my problems with alcohol escalated. I was the first in my family to go to university, so I think I already had a legacy of feeling less than. I felt that I wasn't good enough to have the roles and responsibilities that I had, and I used alcohol really to manage my feelings around all that.
The way you describe it is, of course, with hindsight. Did you have this kind of understanding at the time that alcohol was something you were using to cope with these other things in academia and in your personal life?
Not really. I think I felt like alcohol was the solution to my problems. I felt like it was the thing that was helping me to keep going. I felt I would never have a creative idea if I didn't have the support of alcohol. So alcohol felt like it was a fuel to my academic life. It also felt like the lubrication for the social elements of academic life. A lot of it is about networking and, making friends with the right people and, being able to tell people your ideas in a confident manner. I probably had some kind of inkling that it was also causing me trouble, but that kind of remained at an unconscious level really all through my 20s. And it was only in my 30s that I began to realise that alcohol was a problem for me.
Were there any particular moments which, at the time or perhaps in hindsight, really highlighted, okay, this is becoming a problem and actually getting in the way of the things you thought it would be helping for?
There were some spectacular ones and some just the daily grind of waking up every morning, or coming round, I should say, every morning and trying to get myself ready to go to work. Just the awful hamster wheel, the daily grind, the effort that took to keep going. Those were the kind of day in, day out realizations that there was something wrong. But I had experiences. For example, I chaired an international symposium in blackout. You know, it doesn't mean I was unconscious. It means that I have no memory of actually doing that. At the end of it, a very good friend of mine, a colleague, said to me that they thought I needed to get some help and that they were worried about my drinking.
Were you surprised by this, I suppose, almost an intervention from a colleague?
It was an intervention, and this was well over 20 years ago now, and I look back on that moment with a mixture of horror and absolute gratitude that somebody had the courage and care for me, really, to actually say that they thought I had a problem. I was mortified, absolutely mortified. But I did get in contact with a recovery community, even though it took me several months from that point to actually get sober.
I mean, you mentioned shame there. Is that something that previously prevented you from speaking with colleagues about your use of alcohol?
Absolutely. You know, who would want to admit that they were out of control? You know, especially in academia, perhaps, there is a great stigma around mental health problems. You know, we're supposed to be the brightest and the best, you know, we're supposed to be making contributions, moving the frontiers of knowledge forward. We're not supposed to be struggling with cognitive issues, mental health problems. We're not supposed to be damaging ourselves in the way that somebody with an alcohol addiction is doing. So, yes, the stigma is a massive barrier to help seeking. So what we need to do is to firstly to normalise the problem and to notice how widespread it is in academia, and to dismantle the stigma and make it a positive thing to be able to mention it, to talk about it. I think we've made such great strides with, you know, especially depression and anxiety. But addiction is such a sticky stigma. It's such a taboo, because there's a kind of view in the general public that we bring it upon ourselves, so that we have a choice.
And for you then, when you did start to seek help, is that also something you tried to keep hidden? Is that something you kept separate from your colleagues?
Absolutely. I didn't mention it to any colleagues for many years. Yeah, it took a very, very long time before I tentatively became open with immediate colleagues. Because academia is such a drinking culture, you've got a few options if you don't drink. You can lie about the reasons why you don't drink, or you can be honest about them. And I did lie for many years. You know, I'm not drinking at the moment, I'm on antibiotics, or, you know, I'm on some medication that I can't take alcohol with, or whatever. But over time, I became more comfortable, more secure in my own recovery status. And I think that gave me a little bit of confidence to raise it with peers and to say, yeah, I don't drink. And the reason is that I'm addicted to it. And if I drink, I won't be able to stop. So I just don't do it. But it was a whole other thing to bring that up with senior members of the university. And I was anxious about many different things. I was anxious about causing myself issues with promotion or respect from senior colleagues, or, you know, trust from senior colleagues.
And can I ask, I mean, you mentioned that at academic events with alcohol, at first you found it very difficult to be open about how you were navigating alcohol. Were these events also challenging just in terms of yourself and in terms of being in a context where drinking alcohol is not only the norm, but maybe also expected?
Yes, it's very difficult. I don't know many people in recovery who are fully comfortable in an environment where there's lots of alcohol or lots of drunkenness. I find it quite difficult sometimes being around drunk colleagues. I think that is changing. I think there is a greater awareness of diversity in terms of people's drinking practices. But certainly in the early days of my recovery, I found it incredibly difficult. Not necessarily because I might be tempted to drink, but that is always a possibility. But because I just found it so stressful to be in that environment, it would cause me flashbacks to myself being drunk. I would find people's kind of lack of rationality quite challenging. But as a person in recovery, you see it from a very different perspective, and it is difficult. It's difficult to be around it. Academia has historically, at least, functioned around drinking. Also, other drugs as well, especially the kinds of drugs that enhance cognitive performance in the short term. And that is driven by the kind of pressure to deliver above and beyond the usual 9 to 5 in order to be competitive in an academic environment. There is a sense that people feel they need to have some kind of enhanced performance in order to deliver, and that's a real problem.
Now, you've actually turned some of your academic study to understanding the spiritual elements of recovery and some of the frameworks for recovery. What has it meant to you as an academic to be able to investigate these questions from this more academic side?
That's such a lovely question. It's meant the world to me. I felt as though this research really was me finding my academic voice, actually, and finding the contribution that I could make to the recovery world and to the academic study of recovery. So it was wonderful. You know, recovery from substance misuse is different to recovery from other kinds of mental health issues, because that recovery scene is so inflected by ideas that people associate with spirituality. And of course, the recovery scene is not homogenous. There are many, many different ways of recovering from alcohol or other drug use. But, you know, because of the massive influence of the 12-step episteme, you know, with Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, those all derive from a spiritual notion that the person suffering with the addiction, their condition is a state of powerlessness, and their willpower is not sufficient to overcome the problem. So therefore, they must access a higher power. People interpret that notion of higher power in very different, personal, nuanced ways that reflect the contemporary culture that they're in. So I was trying to show how members of 12-step programs are spiritual innovators in the way they think about higher power.
What does it mean to you to begin to be more open about this subject that does have so much stigma around it? I mean, you're speaking to me now, you're doing this research, you also spoke to Nature for a feature published back in 2025.
It means a lot. It's been a long and difficult journey to become more open. You know, although I openly say I'm in recovery, I always have that underlying anxiety that, am I doing the right thing by saying that? Because I want to be contributing to hope. And of course, if I don't return to use, then that's great. But I also know that I cannot be complacent about that.
What would you have liked to have seen from colleagues in academia, and what should academics listening do to better support their colleagues who are going through challenges with dependency?
I'd love colleagues to become much more informed about addiction, and in particular much more informed about recovery, and to know that recovery is possible. In fact, recovery is probable. Lots and lots of people do recover from addiction. and people should have hope, and they should be encouraged. I think I'd like to see more compassion and more empathy. There can often be a tendency to judge people who struggle with addiction. And of course, somebody who is not functioning in an academic team that is under pressure is a passenger. And that's very difficult for people. That needs to be acknowledged. I'd love it if more academics knew about the recovery-friendly university movement. And that means they're actively seeking ways to support both staff and students who have substance issues. You know, they are counteracting stigma. They're saying that we are proud to have people in recovery within our university community. I think communities are the places in which recovery can happen. In a community where there are people in recovery and they're known and it's seen that they're welcomed and they're celebrated, then that creates its own contagion, and it means that other people can find their way to recovery as well. So universities are actually really places where we can seed recovery for the wider community.
That was Wendy Dossett. We'll hear from her again in a later episode as we discuss the struggles and stigma surrounding fertility. Next up, though, I spoke with another researcher, Victoria Burns, Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Calgary in Canada. Victoria has also transformed her journey with alcohol into an integral part of her work. She is the founder and director of Recovery on Campus Alberta. We'll get to her work with this organisation in just a moment, but first we discussed how Victoria began to reflect on her relationship with alcohol.
I started to think about my relationship with alcohol more critically when I started university. I had my first drink when I was 12, and I didn't really drink throughout high school, but when I did drink, I was prone to blacking out. And then I didn't drink my first year of university, but then my second year, I did an exchange program to France. And that's where I really started to drink in earnest. And when I came back to Canada, so I started going out to the clubs, and I was a weekend warrior, I'll say. I worked hard and played hard. I always held down jobs and was an A student, but I also started to drink more. And it was actually at 19 when a boyfriend gave me an ultimatum to stop drinking because I would black out and end up in risky situations.
And has that been the case since then, that you decided not to drink?
No. So I did a lot more research. I said bye to the boyfriend and thought that he was just being too controlling. And I was mainly a binge drinker. I wasn't a daily drinker. And during that period, there were many, I guess, increasingly dangerous situations that I was in related to my drinking. So I like to say every time I drank, something bad didn't happen, but anytime something bad happened, alcohol was involved. And I sought therapy during this time because I thought I just had to kind of get my anxiety under control and then I'd be able to drink, quote unquote, like a lady. But once I started, I never knew when I was going to stop. So I ended up in my second year of my PhD hitting my final bottom, ending up in the hospital, and that's when I stopped.
You just kind of mentioned it in passing there, but did it shake you up quite a bit to end up having to seek, medical support in this situation?
So yes, I did seek medical support earlier on at my university. I was at McGill University in Montreal, and after some particularly bad binges, I went to the student wellness, and no one really gave me supports related to my drinking. They just told me I needed to drink less and were quite judgmental. And I ended up in the hospital a couple of times, but I was met with more shame than compassion, I'll say. And when I ended up in the hospital that last time, I ended up seeing 3 therapists actually. It was the abstinence-based one who had recommended I try AA. I ended up going to AA to an open speaker meeting that year and hearing, I don't know, I was just ready. It doesn't really make sense why it stuck that time, but it did. And then I found a women's meeting, and I had tried actually 14 months before my final bottom to go to rehab, but they wouldn't accept me because I was quote unquote too organized as a full-time student. I was married, I had a house, all of these things. So on paper, things looked okay, but I was really dying inside.
And now after you did successfully go to AA and transition away from alcohol, how did you approach disclosing this with academic colleagues and with supervisors, for example?
So I didn't disclose to anybody in my academic circles except for a couple of senior academics. And I didn't tell my supervisors. I was advised by senior academics, I did tell not to tell anyone I was in recovery because it could negatively affect my job prospects. I didn't want to do anything that would negatively affect my career. So I really led a double life in recovery for the first 5 years. And I am a social work scholar, and this became increasingly unmanageable as well.
Now, you've actually done research to look at this kind of stigma that you're talking about and this reluctance to disclose that you're talking about. What do we know about how researchers who struggle with substance dependence disclose or don't disclose?
In 2018, I did disclose to my dean, and I was prepared to leave my tenure track job because it was negatively affecting my recovery and my work. I was researching harm reduction and housing first at the time, so I was bumping up against these conversations quite often, and I felt there was a really important perspective that I was not disclosing. So I ended up disclosing to my dean. He was very accepting, and he gave me a green light to conduct research in this area because he said out of his 26-year career, he never had anyone disclose to him about being in recovery. And that really surprised me and intrigued me. And I thought, I can't be the only one. When we look at the data, the prevalence of not only people in recovery, but the rates of addiction. And I ended up getting a small grant and interviewed most of the deans and other service providers about their experiences with faculty disclosing addiction and recovery. And there were only 3 disclosures out of over 300 years of service of all the people I interviewed. However, there were many incidents where faculty members were showing up to the classroom intoxicated, or concerns about people's drinking or drug use, but deans and service providers not really knowing what that process was to help them. And several of the participants actually said, well, as long as they're bringing in grants, no one really cares. And it's also problematic because, like me, I had never met anyone in recovery in academia, and I was a student for 14 years. That fed into the stigma as well and the misunderstanding of what addiction and recovery are. So one of the recommendations of this work was to shift more into this vulnerable, authentic leadership and role model. You know, recovery is not something to be ashamed of. It's something that's actually a source of pride, often committed to service and helping others. So these are people you do want as colleagues, as leaders. And that was something that came out of that study.
I find it almost paradoxical because on the one hand, alcohol is so visible in academia, you know, there's so many contexts in academia, at least in certain countries where alcohol and also alcohol abuse can be quite visible. But then there seems to be a silence around both the misuse of alcohol and the recovery from that misuse.
Yeah, there definitely is a paradox around that. You're stigmatized if you drink too much. You're stigmatized if you stop. You're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. I had been sober for about 2 years at the time, and I successfully passed my defense, and my two supervisors, the tradition was to have some champagne, and they had known me as a drinker as well, but they, had the champagne and everyone was around ready to celebrate, and my supervisor poured me a glass and said, "For you." And I said, "No, thank you." And he said, "Come on, Victoria, you deserve it." And I said, "No, thank you," twice. And then the third time I said, "No, thank you." He said, "Come on, it's not like you're an alcoholic." And I took the glass and I pretended to drink it, and then I threw it away. But it was such a common, kind of innocuous tradition, seemingly, but these are the kind of things we need to, I realize, educate people on how to be a recovery ally, because if I had not been as secure in my recovery, I think, that could have been a shakier moment than it was. And I'm just really grateful that I was able to kind of push through that and not pick up, but these things happen all the time.
Now, you've alluded to this already, but you've kind of turned this stigma for yourself around to some extent, and you're actively trying to do work to support other academics who are going through recovery. Can you explain the work that you're doing a little bit?
Yeah, so another recommendation from that research was to start a peer support group for faculty. I was really committed to creating a recovery-friendly workplace. So if someone did put their hand up and say, I'm struggling with substance use, that they would get the help and be met with compassion and not judgment. There wasn't any recovery programs on campuses until 2019, and it was actually a student at University of British Columbia who started the first campus recovery program in Canada. And it was through that work I was able to hire a part-time coordinator. And now we have 10 going on 11 peer support meetings a week. We've grown from that $8,000 to over $5 million.
With this in mind, what's your hope for the academia of the future, an academia where instead of maybe exacerbating people's issues around substances, we provide a more supportive environment?
I don't want a student or a staff member to feel the shame and stigma of being in recovery or of seeking help. The visibility of people in recovery, I think, is very important, because there's still such a narrow perception of what it means to, A, have an addiction, and B, what it means to be in recovery. And really, we know that one of the pillars of recovery is purpose. So allowing folks who go to treatment to have that community on campus where they have a safe place to go, that we're normalizing the idea that you can have a really enriching, fun, joyful university experience without the need to be intoxicated. It's not about prohibition. There are many people who can use substances in safety, but there are also many people who can't. And up until recently, they didn't really have that space where they could fully be themselves and be around others on similar paths.
Victoria Burns there, joined, as you might have heard towards the end of the interview, by her cat Charlie. This need to be around others on similar paths isn't unique to alcohol. Community can be so important for each and every stigmatized subject we've touched on in this series, from coming out as LGBTQIA+, to navigating research with a disability. And this is equally important for the subject of next week's episode, navigating grief.
I wished I had a grief group. I actually needed advice and directions and resources.
Until then, this has been Off Limits, Academia's Taboos, a podcast from Nature Careers. Thanks for listening. I'm Adam Levy.